Hi and welcome to another Carpenter Tutoring tutorial. I'm Amy and today we are going to talk about scatter plots. First and foremost, we have to talk about what scatter plots are. Scatter plots are the graphs of relationships or groups of multiple points. The data points could be really about anything. We could be comparing the number of hours spent watching television and people's average scores on a test, or the number of burritos that someone consumes in a year compared to their weight. Any relationship could be used in a scatter plot, but basically what a scatter plot does is allow us to see the relationship between the different points within that group. Now, part of the term scatter plot is scatter, and the idea here is that we don't necessarily have a particular shape to the relationship. In other words, I can't just say that this is a straight line or a parabola or an x cubed graph. It doesn't really fit into any particular shape, but what we can do is start to think about the rough shape that we see between these scattered points, and that helps us figure out perhaps a loose or even somewhat strong relationship between the two variables that we're comparing. So scatter plots aren't necessarily perfect, but they're the way that we usually look at data that's produced in the real world. So rather than something that you might see in a textbook where it's been curated in order to fit the situation they're trying to teach, real world situations are much more likely to be kind of messy like we see here and have a little more variability to them. For that reason, scatter plots are a good thing to understand. When we talk about and look at scatter plots, what we're looking for is the correlation between the points. And correlation is a way of saying the relationship between the variables that we see. As one variable increases, does the other one seem to respond in a certain way? There are three general correlations that we can talk about, and we have an example of each here. First, a positive correlation is one in which both variables tend to increase together. So in other words, as we go further to the right on the x-axis, we also tend to go further up on the y-axis. We can see an opposite effect as well, where one variable increases while the other decreases. This would be called a negative correlation. And finally, as we look at our points in the scatter plot, if we can't really see a direction or a rough line taking shape within those points, then we can say there's no correlation. There doesn't seem to be any particular relationship between what happens with one variable and what happens with the other. One of the best ways to determine what kind of correlation we have is to try to draw a trend line in a scatter plot. A trend line is a line that tries to approximate all of the values that we see in that scatter plot and come up with a line that's more or less the average of those points so that we can estimate different values in that scatter plot even though we have imperfect and varied data. So for example, with our first scatter plot here, a trend line might look something like this, where we can see that as the x variable increases, the y variable is also increasing. Drawing this trend line also helps us to understand why we call this a positive correlation, because the slope of the trend line is itself positive. On the flip side, if we were looking at the second scatter plot and wanted to draw a trend line, that trend line may look something more like this. We can see that as the x variable increases, the y variable decreases, and that tells us that the trend line is actually going to have a negative slope. The negative slope of the trend line also matches the negative correlation that we see in this graph. In our third example, there isn't really anything that I can do to draw a line and approximate these points. There doesn't seem to be a set pattern in either moving upward or downward, or to the left or to the right. Because I'm not able to confidently draw a line that shows the average of the direction of motion between these points, I know that this is no correlation. In other words, if we want to talk about the kind of relationship or correlation that we're seeing within a scatter plot, one of the best things we can do is try to approximate that relationship by drawing a trend line. If you find that you can't draw a trend line, you probably have a relationship with no correlation. If you find that your trend line has a positive slope, like we have in our first example, then you have a positive correlation. But if you find that your trend line has a negative slope, like in the second example, then we have a negative correlation. One very important point here, and it's a little bit advanced for if you're just starting scatter plots, but it's still a good one to think about, is that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, that our first graph here was relating hours of reading, let's say maybe in a week, and a test score. What this graph tells us is that students who read more in the week tended to do better on the test. But we don't have any parameters in this that tell us what they were reading. It could have been somebody was reading a Batman comic book for 10 hours because they really like Batman, and they also happened to be really good at the subject the test was on. It tells us that there's a relationship between the number of hours of reading and the test score. But it doesn't tell us that the number of hours someone read caused the test score. In other words, someone who reads for 3 hours a week, then reading for 8 hours the next week, won't suddenly do almost 3 times better on their test. So, correlations like we see in scatter plots don't tell us that the x variable causes the y variable. It just tells us that they are somehow related to each other. Again, as we're using scatter plots at this level, that distinction isn't hugely important, but if you continue on to another class like statistics, that will become incredibly important, so it's a good idea to start thinking about now. Well, I hope it's been helpful to go over scatter plots, their points, their correlations, and their trend lines together. As always, if you have any questions or other topics that you'd like to see covered, please let me know down in the comments. If you enjoy our content, I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me, and I'll catch you next time.